life in all of its forms. Whether it be the roar of the lion or the sound of laughter, it always has a way of reminding you of its existence. The very breath we breathe, the beating of our hearts, even the invisible visions of thought, all serve as a beacon which lights our paths and moves us forward. There was a time where mankind believed that we were meant to rule, that there was some divine hand which caused us to oversee this great world we live in, and even the mysteries of the cosmos. But what if divinity had no say? What if all of our lives, the living and dying, the triumphs and failures, were all meant to connect us to the middle, the place between yes and no, the realm of life that explains our whereabouts and only hints at our future? These thoughts and many more are the catalysts which sparked the brain of one Charles Darwin. In his time, a controversial figure whose theories placed him at odds with the world around him, let alone the great scientific and religious mind of the era. Years later, even after the trial and error of the scientific method has rendered his hypotheses either true or false, there is but one remaining question that we, as human beings, must answer for ourselves. Is life a meaningless mistake, which has somehow thrust us into the gambit of it all? Or is it purposeful, fruitful, a rung on a ladder leading us all to the heights of our own humanity? I'll let you decide. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, Season 2, Episode 1. Thank you all for joining me for the second season of the show. After taking a brief hiatus due to the holidays and side projects, and last but not least, the threat of fire, it's good to be back. Another set of thanks goes to some of you who reached out regarding my safety. Obviously, I'm fine, but unfortunately, some of my fellow Angelinos are left in a bit of limbo. I encourage you all to donate to worthwhile causes, and to those of you who pray, please do. And to those of you who do not, please give. Having said that, we're starting our first episode of the second season by delving into the idea of purpose. To some extent, Charles Darwin is an excellent example of a man existing in a time and place where one's purpose was so closely linked to the heavens that the earth became almost inconsequential. By the end of this episode, I hope to leave you all with a bit of thought to ponder on. Here in America, at this moment in time, under new leadership with very old ideas, I find myself pondering mankind's place in the universe more and more. Hopefully, you too have embarked on that journey. Now, to begin, Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, to Robert and Susanna Darwin. His father, Robert, was a doctor, and from what I could gather, he was a large man for the time, over 6 feet tall, imposing, and known for his great intellect. His mother, Susanna, came from money. Her grandfather, Josiah, came to prominence due to the Wedgwood Pottery Company, which still is in business to this day. By the age of 8, Darwin's mother, Susanna, had died due to stomach cancer, leaving him and his 5 siblings under the care of their father. Darwin himself claimed to not have any true memory of her, except for a few passing and vague visions of her face and a few keepsakes. The next year, he was sent to boarding school, which was only about a mile from his house. There he spent his free time reading and gaining an interest in science, an interest his father Robert encouraged, but only if it led him down the path of being a physician like him. Unfortunately for Darwin, he proved to be an average student. Nothing particularly special, and by 16 he entered the University of Edinburgh to study medicine and further travel down the path of life that was seemingly laid before him before he was even born. Darwin found Edinburgh to be uninspiring. The teachers only taught. There was no nurturing or even push to delve into one's own way of thinking. And 2 years later, after much consideration, Darwin left Edinburgh in order to pursue the clergy. This was not what his father wanted, but at the time, the life within the clergy was honorable, and at the very least safe, so his father did find solace in the choice. 2 years later, that solace was disturbed once again when Darwin decided to leave Christ College and put effort into an ever-growing curiosity about nature. This became concrete when he was invited to take a voyage on the HMS Beagle to explore wildlife and civilization outside of the UK. Darwin jumped at the chance, and by August of 1831, he found himself sailing under the leadership of Captain Robert Fitzroy, hired as a resident naturalist. The journey on the ship was full of ups and downs. Seasickness, coupled with arguments for and against the act of slavery, were commonplace. So much so that Darwin considered leaving the expedition. That is until the ship docked on a small island off the coast of Cape Verde near Mauritania. There, Darwin came across life forms and variations of life and plants which he had never known to exist. Immediately, he began to make notes and collect his writings while preserving his specimens for further study. Further along the expedition, in places like Brazil and Buenos Aires, he came across fossils of giant sloths and giant armadillos not known to have existed. His mind began to take note of the size of the fossils and the incremental changes that must have occurred in order for its current version to exist. This went on for months and years through revolutionary uprisings in Uruguay, and even while finding himself marooned on an island. Darwin kept coming across known and unknown species and the variations within. This all culminated when the ship arrived at the Galapagos Islands. There he observed several animals, tortoises and mammals and birds. One bird in particular, the finch, caused Darwin to open his mind toward the possibility of adaptation. Darwin noticed that although the island contained a multitude of finches, there were slight differences in their beaks. Some finches, due to the design of their beaks, were more apt to eat seeds, while others had beaks which allowed them to eat insects. But they were still finches nevertheless. A year later, while in Australia, he was struck by the scourge of measles which ran through the Aboriginal population, as well as the variety of species he came across. There he realized that the small variances from generation to generation were random. Some of those variances, which were passed down from one generation to the next, allowed a species to flourish. Other variances allowed for death, but there was no choice in the matter. Nature decided which generation would prevail. At the end of the 5-year journey, Darwin returned to the UK, a full-blown naturalist with a wealth of knowledge that far exceeded those among him with formal education. So much so that he began to write a book of his discoveries and the possibility that every species had somehow evolved from an ancestor, and humans had evolved from a common ancestor, the ape. A book came about, The Origin of Species, but the subject matter seemed too controversial, and fearing persecution and even ridicule, the book wasn't released until almost 20 years later due to the encouragement of a friend. Within those 20 years, Darwin had gotten married, had children, written several other books, but none would have the impact of The Origin of Species. Upon its release, Darwin came under a great amount of scrutiny and pressure and rumor. And although the book sold out on its first day of release, Darwin would have to endure years of proving himself under the harsh debates of society and the constant accusations of heresy. He was even named the most dangerous man in England. Luckily, his work was so heavily researched and packed with provable observations that even most scholars and religious detractors eventually acknowledged the sheer rigor which it took to come to such a conclusion. Later, works like The Descent of Man went on to explain the connection of man to the ape, our emotional responses to stress and danger, even the thickness of the helix of the ear, which is only shared between man and ape. Naysayers of the time argued that man did not come from monkeys, but what Darwin went on to explain in great detail was that yes, we did not. We are the descendant of apes, due to our brain structure and even physicality. We even share the same struggle in nature of reproduction, just as some birds had a natural attraction to the colorfulness and size of one's feathers. Humans had a natural inclination toward certain characteristics within each other, not due to some vain conquest, but because physicality was an indicator of reproductive assurance. Whether one chose to follow that instinct was a matter of choice and the lack of an emotional bond. Within his lifetime, Darwin exposed the adaptation of plants for pollination, the curvature of vines towards the sun, even the movement of earthworms as the cause for the descent of the large rocks at Stonehenge. He even discovered that some worms had a fear of bass within music or nature. By the age of 73, Darwin passed away due to a heart condition. Some believe that it was a lingering condition from an illness he had contracted years prior along the expeditions of his youth. He was buried in the scientist's corner of Westminster Abbey as a genius, a disruptor, and a man of humility and great curiosity, mere steps away from his hero, Sir Isaac Newton. I could go on about the impact that Darwin had on science and humanity, how his courage, along with his curious nature, allowed us to view life differently. But I do realize that there are those among us who view him as a problem, an obstacle between truth and belief. But in all honesty, I believe he would have preferred it that way. His purpose in life was not to be a converter of mankind to some blasphemous way of being or thinking. In fact, it was the opposite. Darwin was simply a man, faced with knowledge that contradicted the evidence he saw before him. All he ever asked of us was to simply take a look. Thank you for returning to the second half of today's episode. Quick note, I'd like to put it on out there that I don't think pollination is a word. I think it's pollination. In fact, I'm sure it's pollination. And apologies to all of you who giggled amongst yourself. Now, in the second half of today's episode, we are going to jump into a short story, as always, as usual. My hope is that this story has some sort of connection to the first half, and I believe that it does. This story is called The Council of Five. To begin, in an age long gone, before humans populated the earth in vast numbers, there was a large and fertile landmass known as Pangaea, which contained all animals known and unknown in present time. For several millennia, the animals moved to and fro in relative peace. Herbivores and carnivores cohabitated the land under strict rules of decorum, without the need of a single ruler, and any disputes were settled amongst a chosen council of 5 creatures of varying species. The council went as follows: Bentu, the lion; Joash, the alligator; Nemoic, the eagle; Tunuru, the ant; and Sema, the giraffe. Unlike the other members of the council, Sema was born with a gift, a deformity even, which allowed him to stretch his neck far into the clouds, past the realm of the spirit and time, and see into the future which awaited them all. If the beasts of the field needed courage for the hunt, Sima would warn them of traps or dangerous terrain that would ensnare them if not careful. If a female worried about giving birth or the raising of their offspring, Sima would advise them if they did or did not possess all things needed to be successful. To lose Sima was to lose a conduit to the supernatural, and with the uncertainties of their natural environment, one couldn't afford to test fate. No important decision was made without the council, particularly Sima, and like any living being with the ability to bathe in the power of influence, he became accustomed to a certain amount of prestige and comfort not equally distributed amongst any of the fellow members of the council. These comforts were an inheritance of sorts. For thousands of years, the council always kept a giraffe within the leadership role. Sima, like his father, and his father before him, down to the first ever Council of Five, all possessed the ability to see into the future. But unlike his forefathers, Sima had the ability to not only reveal what the future held, he also gave instruction on how to prepare and behave once these foretellings came to pass. This was a new occurrence. Most animals frowned upon the idea of having to move according to the dictates of any individual, let alone one not of the same species. But over time, after a few chose to do the opposite of Sima's instruction and fall into calamity and despair, it was quietly accepted that Sima's guidance was not only needed, but necessary in order to maintain their lives and land. Along with the acceptance came gifts and tribute. The birds of the air gathered wood and discarded objects and constructed a large hut which Sima resided in, careful to leave space within the center for his long neck to move about the space without obstruction. Each morning, the monkeys would gather the best twigs and apricots and set them before Sima, providing a hearty breakfast in order to keep his mind sharp and intact. In the evenings, Sima would step into the ocean and allow the fish of the sea to shower his body in warm water as the porcupines climbed and scrubbed his body clean. Any need or concern that Sima ever encountered would be handled and excised immediately by any number of creatures, and his days and nights were spent in ease, filled with only matters pertaining to the future of Pangaea and all of the life forms therein. Unlike the hearts of men, these comforts and privilege did not taint his. Sima was humble, gracious, and took his status within the land seriously, and not even a rumor of discontent was ever spoken against him. That is, until a particular premonition reached Sima from the spirit realm. In the early hours of the morning, before the dawn chorus of the birds and crickets reverberated through the land, Sima was awakened by a sound familiar to him only. The sound was strong and forceful, like cascading waters tumbling from above. Immediately, Sima stood on all fours and extended his neck through the opening in the center of his hut, past the clouds and firmament, and into the realm of the future. From there, he saw a great confusion forming within Pangaea. Lions and alligators, elks and pandas, all manner of animals clawing and biting, fighting and harming one another. In the midst of the vision, a voice spoke to him saying, "Prepare for the storms of life, and let wisdom be your refuge." At once, Sima was met by the same cascading water and whisked away like footprints in the sand. In an instant, Sima's long neck retracted back to earth, leaving him deep in thought, surrounded by nothing but the dawn and a keen awareness that change was on the horizon. Weeks later, as the lions participated in a sanctioned hunt of the gazelle in the western fields, an incident occurred where a newborn cub, which had wandered from the pride, was taken and eaten by a pack of nomad hyenas, unfamiliar with the traditions of the land. Bintu, being the only lion on the council, was approached by his kin and asked to avenge the death. Knowing that this was not something he could facilitate on his own, the matter was brought before the council and agreed upon by all members except for Sima, who adamantly spoke against it. When asked by the council why the lives of the hyenas should be spared, Sima reminded Bintu and the other members of the council that the same hunger which caused the lions to hunt and kill the gazelles was the same hunger which caused the hyenas to seize upon the cub. He reminded them of the nature of death and life, and that in Pangaea, revenge should never be an outcome handed out based on emotion, and although the hyenas could be banished to an area less hospitable to them, an outright murder for reasons other than sustenance would have consequences that could reverberate for years to come. An uproar rang throughout the council. Roars and grunts echoed through the night air, but when the arguing and anger subsided, the council decided against the execution of the hyenas. Subsequently, the hyenas were escorted by a band of silverback gorillas to the northern part of Pangaea, surrounded by the immense heat which permeated from the lava lakes where few resources dwelt. After the decision had been made and the result spread amongst the animals, Bintu returned to his kin, where he was ridiculed and deemed weak for allowing the death to go without what they considered to be true punishment. From that moment forward, hatred began to grow in Bintu's heart towards Sima, but he never voiced it aloud. Years later, in the swamplands, a dispute between the alligators and snakes arose over a water-borne disease which spread within the marsh, causing sickness and death to run rampant amongst the reptiles. The alligators blamed the snakes blamed the alligators, and over time, the matter was brought before Joash in order to mediate the ever-growing contempt between the snakes and his clan. At the meeting of the council, Joash petitioned for segregation between his species based on size and perceived value. Joash argued that if the snakes were the true cause of the illness, then they should suffer together and allow nature to detach the strong from the weak. To the alligator, it made no sense to risk extinction based on the poor decisions of creatures much smaller and careless as the snakes. Again, the council came to a vote, and again Sima was the sole voice of dissent. Sima calmly explained to Joash that sickness, whether brought on by the snakes or a mosquito, must be treated individually. Sima suggested that if asked properly, the snakes would be more than willing to pinpoint the sick and quarantine them, as should the alligators, and let nature take its course. After the sick had either healed or passed away, and the illness was no more, they could once again coexist within the marsh, safe with the knowledge of prevention and the proper protocols if illness were ever to creep into the waters again. Joash refused, saying that the alligators were far too large in number and size to simply wait until death had dwindled their numbers. The marsh needed them for protection and as a silent warning to any intruder. Sima laughed at the arrogance of Joash's words and replied, "Does the safety of the marsh come from the number of alligators seen, or the fear that resides in the belief of the unseen? Is not the imagination more powerful than the truth?" The council sat in silence, waiting for Joash to challenge Sima's words, but there was nothing to be said. Immediately, Joash stormed out of the meeting and slithered back into the marsh alongside his kin, while a hatred for Sima simmered in his heart. From then on, a clandestine alliance between the lions and the alligators began to form. Under the cover of night, Joash and Bintu and the elite members of their species began to plot ways to remove Sima from the council. Bintu, eager to completely rid Sima from existence, suggested death, but Joash, angry but not foolish, reminded him that the only sanctioned death allowed was due to the hunt, and any outright murder would be met by the execution of all conspirators. Bintu apologized, understanding that he had let his anger overtake him, but if allowed, he believed that he could convince Nemoac the eagle and Tanuru the ant to join their cause, and at the very least, banish Sima from sight. Joash, eager to know what Bintu had in mind, inquired about the nature of his plans, but Bintu assured him that it would be best if he did not know until it became obvious. Joash and his ilk swore their secrecy, and with that, they parted ways, trusting that Bintu would deliver the desired result. The next morning, Bintu traveled south to the Jaru mountain range. Knowing the whereabouts of Nemoac, he made the arduous trek upwards along Mount Beak, the tallest and most prominent elevation, for hours, until he was met by a host of eagles, each of varying size and esteem, all prepared to defend their domain against any threat. Sensing the hostility, Bentu lowered his tail, bowed his great mane until it scraped the ground, and humbly asked to speak to Nemoak at once. By the time he lifted his head and opened his eyes, Nemoak stood before him, head tilted, with a curious gaze across his face. After presenting a fang-filled grin, Bentu asked if he and Nemoak could speak alone. Skeptical but curious, Nemoak spread his large wings, and instantly his feathered brethren dispersed, leaving the two alone at the summit, surrounded by Pangaea in all of its beauty. "What brings you to Mount Beak?" asked Nemoak, while slowly lowering his wings to his side. "Sima," replied Bentu, with worry on his face. "He confided in me last night, told me of a new premonition, a premonition which concerns you and Tanuru the ant. It gives me no joy to reveal this to you, but the ant has grown jealous of you and your kind." With his interest piqued, Nemoak listened as Bentu went on to say that in a vision, Sima saw that Tanuru had become envious of the eagles. Him and his brethren were tired of living deep within the soil, relegated to a life of hard labor and tunneling, while the eagles were free to roam wherever their hearts desired. In the premonition, Sima saw that Tanuru would soon become disagreeable on any matter concerning Nemoak and his winged ilk. Tanuru's goal was to frustrate them to the point that they would flee to a separate part of Pangaea, and Nemoak would rescind his position in the council in order to dwell with his own permanently. In turn, this would leave Tanuru with more sway, and eventually the ability for the ants to multiply and install Tanuru as ruler of Pangaea. Nemoak, overcome with the folly of the revelation, laughed and cawed so loudly that it echoed for miles. Once he got a hold of himself, he replied, "I could eat them all in one sitting. Surely this premonition is false." Bentu, feigning disrespect, roared at Nemoak with all of his might, which caused Nemoak to silence himself. "How dare you disrespect a warning from the realm of time and future? I have come here through harsh terrain, with no regard of my own life, only to advise you of matters told to me in secret. And you laugh. So be it." As Bentu turned to depart, Nemoak apologized and expressed his appreciation of the gesture, and asked what he should do. With his back to Nemoak, a mischievous grin grew on his face. Allowing the smile to fade, Bentu turned to Nemoak, saying, "At the next council meeting, follow my lead, no matter what I say. Joash will do the same. Then we will expose this treachery and rid ourselves of the traitor." Nemoak agreed and stood silently as Bentu descended Mount Beak underneath a setting sun, concealing the dark joy which fluttered behind his eyes. The next morning, Sima was awakened by the sound of furious knocking and pawing at the entrance of his hut. After a slow rise, Sima made his way to the entrance and removed a large log which blocked the opening. Immediately, Bentu, looking haggard and disturbed, entered and bowed before Sima before speaking. "My brother," said Bentu, "I too have had a premonition, a dark and terrible vision which I must reveal to you. My only request is that you keep this between us. I fear for my life if this was to be made public. Can I trust you, brother?" Concerned for Bentu's safety, Sima promised to keep Bentu's word between them. Without a moment's hesitation, Bentu began. "Sima, as I slept last night, my ancestors came to me and revealed the hearts of the other members of the council. They aim to do away with you, even kill you if they must." Sima, unwilling to believe this, lowered his great neck until his eyes met Bentu's, leaving them face to face. "Go on," said Sima, his full attention given to Bentu and his continued deceit. "Tonight, At the meeting of the council, Joash, Nemoach, and Tanuru will rise up against one another and seek your counsel. Nothing you say will ease them. They will use your words against you and attempt to label you as a contrarian and a dictator, and I alone will be your only defense. You will defend me from a lie? Asked Sema, his eyes still focused on Bintu. Truth will be my defense. Rest assured. Shaking his enormous mane in frustration, Bintu explained that it would not be a matter of simple words. Bintu went on to say that in his vision, the reptiles, birds, and insects were in agreement, and no matter what wise words he would conjure, the end result would be his expulsion from Pangaea. And how can I trust this premonition, this vision of yours? How can I trust that it's true? Asked Sema while lifting his neck upward. The disturbance will be in this order, replied Bintu. Joash first, then Nemoach, and Tanuru, that they will bicker. Then slowly, all three will turn on me. That will be the evidence of the truth you seek. As Sema stood in silence, meditating on Bintu's words, a single drop of rain entered the hut through the hole in the center, landing on Sema's head. Sema extended his neck through the opening and gazed upon the thick clouds gathering in the distance. He then sniffed the air with a long, concentrated inhale. A storm is coming, said Sema, while staring down at Bintu. It would be wise of you to prepare your clan. Taking offense to the warning, Bintu scoffed at Sema and assured him that every living being in Pangaea was equipped to handle any storm and that the only thing of importance was to call for a meeting at once. Just then, a loud clap of thunder followed by a torrential downpour began to drench the land, enveloping Sema and Bintu in a gust of wind and rainwater. Warn your clan, repeated Sema while shaking the rain from his neck. Bintu's face slowly churned into rebellion, and after backing away from the center of the hut, Bintu replied, First we meet, before exiting the hut in a pompous stroll. Alone, Sema stretched his neck through the hole again to see Bintu casually walking away as the fury of the storm began to grow in intensity. Saddened by his ignorance, he turned his head upwards toward the sky and whispered, What should I do? Again, another clap of thunder bellowed through the air, and Sema retracted his neck. I understand. Later at the council meeting, Bintu, Nemoach, Tanuru, and Joash sat in silence as the sound of crackling trees, howling winds, and an ever-increasing amount of rain hinted at the chaos outside. Even the small clay hut which housed their meeting held about an inch of water which slowly rose by the second, and through all of this, the only member missing was Sema. The council of four meandered in silence for what seemed like an eternity until Bintu decided to speak. The coward isn't coming, is he? Silence filled the room until Tanuru, propped on a twig, spoke, saying, I think I should head back underground to the tunnels. My brethren, they need me. Nemoach squawked and replied, No need to run away now that your plans have been ruined. Confused, Tanuru looked to Bintu, who pretended to be just as lost. Joash, now concerned for his own safety, began to move toward the exit, but Bintu blocked his path before releasing a low rumble of a growl. Our brethren will be fine, said Bintu, while nudging Joash away from the exit. We need to find Sema and hold council. There are more important matters to tend to. More silence as Bintu and Joash locked eyes for a considerable amount of time. Suddenly, an intimidated Joash conceded that it would be best to locate Sema before heading their separate ways. Nemoach, on the verge of disagreeing, locked eyes with Bintu, who slowly nodded. Maybe we should look for Sema first. At least make sure he's safe, said Nemoach, disgusted with himself. Are all of you insane? Replied Tanuru. The storm is worsening with every breath we take. We need to adjourn the meeting, and return to our clan. Seema can fend for himself. From outside, another thunderclap echoed. You always have to go against us, don't you? Said Nemoac while inching closer to Tanuro. Growing annoyed with Nemoac's tone, Tanuro began to answer back, but before he could open his mouth, Nemoac leaped onto Tanuro's twig and swallowed him whole, shocking the rest of the council. Furious, Joash advanced toward Nemoac with his mighty jaws open. Bintu, attempting to intervene, clawed at Joash's back and bit his scaled tail with as much force as he could muster. From there, Nemoac flew toward Joash, beak first, attempting to pluck out his eyes or at the very least harm him in any way possible. Instantly, a full-on brawl began to take place. From outside of the tent, one could hear growling and biting, squawking and squealing, the sounds of a melee muffled underneath a cloak of rain and thunder until, moments later, Bintu emerged from the hut, alone, panting, with blood on his face and feathers in his mouth. The storm had now morphed into a tempest, ripping apart trees and tossing miscellaneous items in every direction. Bintu, unbothered and full of rage, headed towards Seema's hut, his blood-soaked claws digging into every patch of wet earth with each step. Behind him in his wake, on the inside of the council's hut, the torn and mangled bodies of Joash and Nemoac lied lifeless in a puddle of rainfall and blood. By the time Bintu completed fighting his way past the now hurricane-force winds and rain falling in sheets, he arrived at Seema's hut to find that it had been torn apart. Wood and all of the comforts it once contained, now scattered and strewn about like his hopes for revenge. At once, Bintu began to search high and low for Seema, past the fleeing herds of cattle, the prickles of porcupines, and armies of frogs, every manner of creature chaotically seeking shelter. In the distance, the roars and pleading of his pride, begging him to join them in the escape, were ignored and muffled by the clamor of anger which filled his heart. This continued for hours until the might of the storm forced him to bury himself within a thicket of brambles until morning, when the storm finally subsided. At daybreak, Bintu opened his eyes to find himself surrounded by every manner of creature. Geese and turtles, crocodiles, elks, even a small colony of bees hovered above them all, each animal bubbling with anger and spite. Knowing that he would soon be the recipient of this anger, Bintu quickly removed himself from the thicket, saying, I know that you all are beside yourself, crestfallen at the loss of your dens and nests and burrows. But I assure you, it is not me who's to blame. It is Seema who crept away in the night like a villain, leaving us all to manage for ourselves. The crowd grew loud with grunts and snorts until Bintu spoke again, saying, If you will allow me, I submit that we all search for that charlatan and make him explain himself, and if he has no answer, I will be the first among you to rip his throat from his frame. Waiting for an answer, Bintu stood patiently until the crowd parted, making room for him to lead the way. With his head and tail lowered, Bintu moved through the center of the crowd with a modest stride until before he knew it, he and hundreds of animals began searching through Pangaea, all seeking an explanation from their once beloved prophet, Seema. Days and miles later, through demolished swampland and water-soaked pastures, the collection of creatures traveled in every direction only to achieve the same result. Seema had abandoned them. Murmurs and whines began to become commonplace until by chance, while surveying a large cave system in the distance, a pair of long and yellow legs peeked through the opening of the largest cave. It was Seema's legs, dangling sideways over the mouth of the enclosure. Not wasting a second, Bintu, followed by the other creatures, rushed towards Seema in a rumble which shook the foundations of the land until they arrived to find Seema alone, sleeping in the cave, surrounded by apricots and some of the few comforts he managed to gather before his escape. Frustrated, one of the bees landed on Seema's leg and plunged its stinger into his thigh. startling Seema and awakening him to find a sea of creatures, led by Bintu, seething before him. Rising to his feet, Seema greeted them with a smile which was not returned. "Good. You are all safe. The ancestors protected us." "Why didn't you warn us?" snapped Bintu. "Surely you received a premonition for us to follow." Before Seema could answer, a rhinoceros yelled out from the back of the crowd saying, "We have suffered losses. Our numbers have dwindled, and you lie sleeping. You must answer for your betrayal." Looking over the crowd, Seema replied, "Did you not feel the rain? Did the wind not toss your possessions about like they did mine? How about the birds? Did you not look up at the sky to see the flocks escaping in their rigorous formations?" The crowd began to settle as Seema continued, "What warning could I have ever given you if you choose to ignore the obvious?" But you are our insight, our window into the unknown," shouted a chimpanzee perched upon a cheetah's back. "You gave no instructions." Seema, growing tired of their accusations, lowered his great neck to the crowd, saying, "Instruction will never match the wisdom of common sense. Now go, leave me alone, and the next time you choose to blame anyone for your own misfortunes, perhaps take a moment to consider the part that you have played in your own calamity." With that, Seema turned his back to the crowd and re-entered his cave. Stewing in wrath, Bintu released a mighty roar and extended his fangs and claws, ready to pounce upon Seema. But when he turned to the crowd, looking to see if they had his back, they all began to disperse. One by one, in all directions, humbled by the simplicity of Seema's words. Standing alone, Bintu retracted his claws and closed his mouth and watched as Seema lowered himself within the cave and closed his eyes in peace. Deflated and at a loss for words, Bintu too walked away from the cave, never to be seen again. And Seema, he went back to sleep. Thank you all for rejoining me for the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. We are back. This is season 2. And as always, I'll be back every other week, give or take, with another episode for you. I do appreciate you guys for hanging in there, even in the little small hiatus that I needed to take. Overall, this episode pretty much is about the idea of purpose, the idea of finding oneself and believing in oneself, but also in the idea of believing in yourself enough to know that some of the answers that you seek are within you. Having said that, you can always reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. As always, have a great couple of days, great week. Just be great. And as always be mindful of the stories you tell yourself. Until we speak again, goodbye.